The Green Crocodile. That is what Ukrainian engineers called their creation in the early 1990s. What made it unusual was not a single detail, it was the idea itself. A standard KrAZ truck and a T-64 tank were combined and turned into a racing machine for circuit racing. Win on Sunday, sell on Monday. For most of the 20th century, this formula perfectly described the main value of motorsport for car manufacturers. Even though the era when almost production-ready cars lined up on the grid, with their road-going versions waiting in showrooms, is long gone, victories on the racetrack have remained powerful advertising and an effective way to reach a broad audience. It was exactly this conclusion that the management of KrAZ, the Kremenchuk-based truck manufacturer, reached in the early 1990s. But to understand that decision, it's important to first look at the situation the company itself was facing. KrAZ specialized in heavy trucks, dump trucks, and special-purpose vehicles. During the Soviet era, these machines were supplied both to the military and to civilian industries. In a centrally planned economy, KrAZ never had to look for customers. That role was handled by the state. The factory focused solely on engineering and production. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, everything changed, and not for the better. As the economy shifted from central planning to a market system, KrAZ, like many former Soviet manufacturers, found itself with virtually no new models. Its lineup was reduced to just two trucks, commonly known by informal nicknames, one with a wooden-framed cab and another with a boxy, angular design. By 1991, KrAZ was still producing a truck with a wood and metal cab, a design whose first prototypes dated back to 1947, 44 years earlier. For utilitarian machinery, age alone is not always a critical issue. But the real problem was that this truck belonged to a completely different era. By the early 1990s, it was widely perceived as a mechanical dinosaur from the past, even by the standards of poorer post-Soviet countries. The situation with the more modern boxy cab was not much better. Domestic government orders within Ukraine had nearly disappeared. Some purchases continued out of inertia from Russia, mainly for oil and gas regions where simplicity and off-road capability were still valued. But private buyers, both inside Ukraine and abroad, showed little interest in KrAZ trucks. Leasing programs were virtually non-existent at the time, and businesses spending their own cash preferred imported used trucks instead. To be fair, Soviet-era KrAZ trucks were known for their durability. They could endure harsh conditions, bad roads, and heavy workloads. Comfort, however, or rather the lack of it, became legendary in its own way. One popular saying summed it up perfectly. A Tatra is a good truck, but after 5 years in our conditions, you can write it off. With a KrAZ, after 5 years, you write off the driver. In short, by the 1990s, KrAZ had to rebuild its reputation from scratch. And this is where motorsport entered the picture at exactly the right moment. Despite the fact that KrAZ already had all-wheel drive trucks in its lineup, and that an entry into the Dakar Rally might have seemed like a more logical choice, the team decided to take a different path and focus on circuit truck racing. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, truck circuit racing had become extremely popular in Europe. The first European championship was held back in 1985, and tractor unit racing quickly gained not only a loyal audience, but, more importantly, television attention. Any truck that appeared on camera during these races instantly gained international visibility. And that was exactly what KrAZ needed. The first serious problem for the engineers appeared almost immediately. Under the European truck racing regulations in force between 1985 and 1993, race vehicles were required to be based on series production trucks. And this is where the real issue emerged. In the early 1990s, KrAZ simply did not have a two-axle tractor unit in its production lineup. Had this racing project started just a few years later, after FIA officials began strictly enforcing the letter of the regulations, it would have had no chance of approval at all. Fortunately for KrAZ, in 1991 the rules were still interpreted rather loosely, and the team decided to take advantage of that. The race truck was effectively built from scratch in Kremenchuk. In reality, it was a pure prototype. but it carried a factory identification plate stamped with the designation 5460, presented as if it were a production version of a new KrAZ tractor unit. Formally, it was a production model. In practice, it was a complete fiction. However, the championship officials chose not to look too closely into the details. Finding anything in this race truck that clearly comes from production KrAZ models is not an easy task. In fact, the only direct link to a road-going vehicle is the standard cab taken from the KrAZ 250. And that is where the similarities essentially end. The fiberglass hood and the aerodynamic bodywork were completely custom-made. The braking system and racing tires had to be sourced abroad, with help from Lucas and Pirelli. The independent torsion bar suspension, however, was developed in-house by KrAZ engineers and could genuinely be considered an engineering achievement of their own. But the true centerpiece of the race, KrAZ 5460, was, of course, its engine. The standard Yaroslavl diesel used in production trucks was completely unsuitable for racing. It was simply too weak. On top of that, the outdated engine design left almost no room for serious power increases. Buying a foreign engine would have been the logical solution, but the factory, struggling financially at the time, simply could not afford it. The solution was found much closer to home, in Kharkiv. That is where the Malyshev plant was located, one of the key centers of Soviet tank engineering. Over the decades, some of the most technologically advanced tanks of the Soviet era were developed there, from the T-34 to the T-64. And while the T-72 became the Army's mass-produced workhorse, the Kharkiv-built T-64 was always considered more advanced and was reserved for elite units. Its defining feature was the compact 5 TDF diesel engine, powerful, high-revving, and extremely unconventional in design. And it was precisely this engine that KrAZ engineers decided to install in their race truck. The 5TDF engine is capable of surprising anyone who is not used to the logic of military engineering. Just consider this: a two-stroke, five-cylinder turbo diesel with opposed pistons. Even on paper, it sounds unconventional. In its standard tank configuration, with a displacement of 13.5 liters, this engine produced 700 horsepower. It could run not only on diesel fuel, but also on aviation kerosene, and, if necessary, even on low-octane gasoline. But KrAZ engineers did not stop at 700 horsepower. The tank engine was pushed to roughly 1,000 horsepower. Despite being extremely heavy, the engine remained remarkably compact. This allowed it to be mounted deep within the frame, significantly lowering the truck's center of gravity. There was no experimentation with the transmission either. Along with the engine, the Kharkiv engineers supplied the original tank gearbox, a 7-speed planetary manual transmission. This exact unit was installed in the race truck. Even the gear selector itself remained a tank component. Testing at the Chaika circuit near Kyiv showed that all of this effort was worthwhile. The 7-ton KrAZ 5460 accelerated from 0 to 100 kilometers per hour in roughly 12 seconds, with a top speed of around 200 kilometers per hour. That was more than enough. Truck racing regulations limited maximum speed to 160 kilometers per hour. In other words, the Green Crocodile genuinely had a chance to compete on the circuit. The team from Kremenchuk made its competitive debut in the summer of 1992 at the Nürburgring. An unfamiliar team with an unfamiliar machine initially sparked curiosity among both spectators and rivals. But that curiosity quickly turned into genuine surprise. During practice sessions and qualifying, the KrAZ race truck proved to be unexpectedly fast. Behind the wheel was Ukrainian circuit racing champion Oleksandr Medvedchenko, who set the 7th fastest time out of 25 competitors. But problems soon followed. Under race conditions, the two-stroke tank diesel produced heavy smoke. A thick black plume trailed behind the truck, and rival teams began to complain, arguing that the smoke made driving difficult. The teams jointly appealed to the race organizers. The complaint was reviewed and ultimately rejected. The organizers chose to give the debuting team a chance and allowed the Green Crocodile to start the Sunday race. Then came the setback. one of the most frustrating and absurd imaginable. At the critical moment, a rear hub bearing failed. The team had no spare. According to eyewitnesses, many people had grown genuinely sympathetic toward this unusual team from a newly independent post-Soviet country and tried to help completely selflessly. One enthusiast even offered to fly a team member by private helicopter to eastern Germany, where KrAZ trucks were still in service and the required part could, at least in theory, be found. But all efforts proved futile. The bearing used on the race KrAZ was non-standard, a custom-made component produced specifically for this one machine and in a single example. The Green Crocodile never made it to the start. Its racing career ended almost before it had truly begun. It was clear that the project required further development, and therefore time and money. Time was not the issue. Funding was. The team lacked even the foreign currency needed for basic travel and logistical expenses. It also became evident that the excessive smoke produced by the tank engine was unlikely to be solved in a fundamental way. Complaints from rivals would only increase. As a result, the project was shut down in Kremenchuk, and yet it would be wrong to say that everything was in vain. KrAZ was noticed abroad. Soon afterward came cooperation with the Italian company Iveco, followed by partnerships with Renault, and later with Chinese manufacturers. The Kremenchuk truck plant still exists today. While Soviet-era production volumes are now a thing of the past, the factory continues to build heavy vehicles. In recent years, against the backdrop of the war in Ukraine, it has largely shifted toward military production, with export potential once the conflict ends. I want to end the story of the Green Crocodile on a positive note. Anyone who cares about engineering and machinery feels a sense of loss when hearing about rare vehicles and unique prototypes being scrapped. For factories and companies, such machines often have no practical value. They simply take up space in workshops and storage halls. As a result, many truly interesting and important vehicles have been destroyed. And this is not limited to the Soviet Union. It has happened all over the world. But the Green Crocodile was lucky. By sheer coincidence, it remained stored inside one of the factory buildings until 2019. It was never dismantled, never stripped for parts, and never converted back into a regular truck. It survived exactly in the condition it returned from the Nürburgring. In this footage, workers at the Kremenchuk truck plant start its engine for the first time after nearly 30 years of inactivity. That same year, the Green Crocodile was restored, and since then, it has regularly appeared at exhibitions and technical shows. So for now, it's far too early to write it off.